Classical music. Features, developments and composers. Classical music. Classical with a small c means anything that is top class and particularly refers to the ancient Greeks and Romans. With a capital C, it means a specific style of composers. The term classical is commonly and incorrectly applied to any music which is not modern. The correct term for this is actually art music. So art music encompasses things like Baroque music, classical music, romantic music, as well as 20th century music written for the orchestra. So composers of the period. So you can see here there's some names here like Bach. Now they are actually related to the other Bach, but the ones that you're more familiar would be with Beethoven, Haydn and Mozart. Style galant. This is an early classical style and is very courtly style. It was meant to please the listener as opposed to making the listener think. C.P.E. Bach and J.C. Bach were the main composers who made use of this style. Later classical style. This style made more of balance and control, grace and beauty of a melody, and form of design became more important. And here's an example. The texture of this era, classical music is basically homophonic, whereas Baroque music was more polyphonic, which is more than one melody played at a time. Homophonic means a single melody line with a harmonic or chordal accompaniment. The orchestra. The orchestra began to grow at this time. The harpsichord continuo gradually fell out of use. Wind instruments became more important, especially the horns to bind the texture. Strings were still the main instrument, to which were added 2 horns, 1 or 2 flutes, a pair of oboes. Gradually the composers add 1 or 2 bassoons and occasionally a pair of trumpets or a pair of kettle drums, depending on the composer and what their preferences were. Clarinets were also introduced in this era. Towards the end of the 18th century, Mozart was the composer responsible for popularizing the clarinet. The woodwind section became a self-contained section, had 1 or 2 flutes, 2 oboes, 2 clarinets, 2 bassoons, 2 horns, 2 trumpets and 2 kettle drums, and 2 strings were also added to the orchestra. And in that piece you could hear obviously the strings, but also the woodwind section that came in there with the flutes. Music for piano. Now the piano actually it was a development from the harpsichord, and it started to become very popular in this era. It was invented in as early as 1698 by Cristofori in Italy. This instrument allows soft and loud notes to be played, and that is why it was called the pianoforte, because it could actually go soft and loud. Piano meaning soft, forte meaning loud. The strings were hit by hammers as opposed to being plucked like they were in the harpsichord. More expression could be played with this type of method or action. In other words, it could play legato or staccato or cantabile, which means like singing. The Alberti bass is a simple broken chords repeated in the left hand, which keeps the music going and outlines the harmony. It was a development from the figured bass, which was more common in the Baroque era. So I'll play this one while I'm reading here. A very famous piece, which I'm sure you'll know, Fur-Elise. C.P.R. Bach was one of the first piano composers and started composing around 1750. J.C. Bach gave the first piano performance in London. A lot of music was printed for harpsichord or piano, but the harpsichord gradually faded out of use. And this one, as you know, is Fur-Elise. The sonata. A sonata is a work in several movements for 1 or 2 instruments. With 3 instruments, it is a trio. With 4, it is obviously a quartet. And with 5, it is a quintet. And here's an example of part of a sonata, a piano sonata. Sonata form. Sonata form is a way of building up an individual movement, not a piece. It consists of 3 sections. The first one is the exposition. The composer exposes his musical ideas. The main ideas are called subjects. The first subject is in the tonic, which is the home key, which modulates or changes key near to the end to a bridge, which is the transition passage, which leads to the second subject. The second subject is in a new but related key, often the dominant, which is the STA, or relative major, if the first key is in a minor key. The second subject is usually more tuneful. This sounds like a lot of gobbledygook, but if you just actually find a sonata piece and have a listen and listen for the actual changes in the sections, you'll know what this is talking about. It then goes on to the development. Here the ideas are developed or had slightly some variations, and it creates a feeling of tension and often conflict. The climax might be in this actual section. And then the last part is the recapitulation. The music is repeated from the beginning, but the second subject is now in the tonic. So instead of being in a different key, it is now transposed into the tonic key. Finally, the music may have a coda, which is basically Italian for tail, which rounds off the music. The other main development in classical times was the symphony. Symphony means a sonata for orchestra. It grew from the Italian overture, but the symphony has 3 movements instead of 3 sections. Later on, a 4th movement was added, which is commonly a minuet or a trio. Stamitz was the first famous symphony composer and the father of this style. Haydn and Mozart perfected the symphony in the second half of the 18th century. The symphony can be broken down into first movement, which is usually fast and in sonata form. Second movement, which is usually slower and more song-like. It could be a sonata form or ternary form and perhaps with variations. The third movement, Haydn and Mozart wrote a minute in trio at this point. Beethoven later turned this into a scherzo, which is a direct translation is a joke, so more of a comical section. And the 4th movement, which is fast and often light-hearted. Haydn wrote numerous sonatas, including the Surprise Symphony, the Drum Roll Symphony, and the London Symphony. This is a Beethoven symphony. Trios and quartets were also in 4 movements. Sonatas might have 3 or 4 movements. The classical concerto did not include the minuet, so only had 3 movements. The concerto. It developed from the Baroque era, and it contains a solo instrument and an orchestra. There are 3 movements, slow, fast, slow. The first movement has a double exposition. The first is for the orchestra alone, and then it is followed by the soloist. In other words, it plays one part and then the soloist does it. The second with the second subject group in the related key. Then comes the development and the recapitulation, which is the beginning again, for both orchestra and the soloist. Towards the end, the orchestra pauses and the soloist plays a cadenza, which is a short passage based on the themes heard earlier, which displays the brilliance of the player. A cadenza is basically a time for the performer or the soloist, which it was usually written for, to show off everything they could do, all the fancy things they could do. When the soloist finishes, the soloist ends with a trill, which signifies the orchestra should come in and finish off the piece. This often happens and is still done in a lot of rock music today, where they have that big ending or that big note, and then they all finish together in that one last note together to signify the end of the piece. So a lot of things that we've got in rock music have come from classical beginnings. The orchestra then plays the coda to the end. And this is a trumpet concerto. Opera. Classical composers wrote much vocal music, especially opera. Gluck was an important opera composer. Orfeo ad Eurydice is one of his works. He made the actions more important in the opera. At the start of the opera, the overture prepared the audience for what was to come. Just like in a movie today, when you see when all the credits are rolling and when the movie is just about to start, that's called an overture, and this is where it comes from in opera. The overture prepared the audience for what was to come. Mozart wrote operas including The Marriage of Figaro, The Magic Flute, and Don Giovanni. The Magic Flute is an example of a singspiel, which is an opera in which singing is mixed up with dialogue, which is a bit like our musicals. The orchestra mirrors the mood and drama of the action. Don Giovanni is an example of opera buffa, which is a comic opera. And here's an example of a little bit of opera for you. Most operas of this era were written in Italian. Main features of classical music. It was less complicated texture than Baroque. It was more homophonic and less polyphonic. Its emphasis was on beauty, elegance, and balance. There was more variety and contrast within a piece than in Baroque music. The dynamics were, they had contrast and varying sections, so it went from soft to loud with crescendos and decrescendos in between. There was more variety in instruments because there were certainly a lot more instruments available. There's variety in pitch, in tempo, in key, mood, and obviously in tone colour, which is timbre. Melodies tended to be shorter than those in the Baroque era, with clear-cut phrases and clearly marked cadences, and a cadence is an ending. The orchestra increases in size and range. The harpsichord falls out of use and is replaced by the piano, and the woodwind becomes a self-contained section. The piano takes over, often with the Alberti bass accompaniment, which was a development from the ground bass in the Renaissance and the basso continuo in the Baroque. Importance was given to instrumental music, the sonato, trio, string quartet, symphony, and the concerto. And sonata form was the most important design. And here's a little piece to end on.